Hello, I'm Haxie, and you're watching Haxie Flies. I am a student pilot with about 20 hours of experience so far, which is, about nothing. Today, my instructor is taking me out on my first cross country. A cross country being to another airport that is at least 50 miles away from our home airport. As fate would have it, once again, I screwed up the audio. I think I know what's wrong with it this time, though. I tried to put in some effects to fix it, but it still is really bad. So I'm going to record this on a separate track and hope I can figure out how to get YouTube to make this a separate audio track. And so you can switch between my narration and the actual audio of the flight. It's not easy to listen to, so I'm not going to make you listen to it the whole time. Today is a rather warm day, so I'm using my hat to cover the keys because the keys were sitting in the sun for a while. The engine was also fairly difficult to start, so you'll see us troubleshooting and trying to get the engine to start here. Not quite there. Nope, not going to work that time either. So now I'm messing with the audio, and I'm going to figure out that I had the same problem this time as I did last time. And we're going to spend a good minute or so trying to troubleshoot it, trying to figure out if there's anything that I can do. But ultimately, well, you'll hear what it sounds like here pretty soon. I think I found out what the issue is, though, with the audio is recording too loudly. It may be that the recording app on my phone is trying to record it as a microphone and it's being output as a line out. Basically, it would go straight into headphones, and that causes the audio to be blown out. if you want to hear what that sounds like, switch to the other audio track. Should be coming up here in a minute. I don't think I mentioned this before. This plane is a club plane. I belong to a flying club here in town, which basically means I'm part owner of this plane. It's sort of like renting, but not officially. One of the things that came up with the club was leaning the engine as we taxi. Without getting into a whole lot of technical details, leaning basically allows the engine to run a little cleaner with the sacrifice of a little bit of power. So while taxiing and while in cruise, you really should be leaning the mixture. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to do this. And there's a lot of debate on the best way of doing it. But in this case, it's just important that it is done during taxi and cruise. You'll see me here in a minute before we do the run-up and before we do the takeoff. We'll throw the mixture back up to full. So we want the full power available of the engine during that phase of flight. The active runway, runway 31, is on this side of the airport. After I make this turn here, it'll be straight in front of us, the start of the runway. There really isn't a whole lot of room around there to do the run-up. So we kind of just park it up here at the end of the hangars, where there's still a little bit of room to maneuver, and then we'll redo the run-up there. We also slightly turn the airplane into the wind so that we get a little bit of wind going into the engine while we're doing the run-up. So as you can see, it's going to stress the engine a little bit, which is the purpose of doing it. So we want to give the wind the opportunity to cool the engine while we're stressing it. The idea here is just to exercise the engine, turn off bits and components, make sure everything's working as it's supposed to. So we definitely want to find out if something's wrong with the engine while we're still on the ground. Once you're in the air, your options are rather limited. Seem like it takes a long time. There's a lot to do. We really want to figure out everything that we need to figure out before we actually get in the air so that there's as few surprises as possible when we get in the air. One of the things that I found on an earlier flight, being right there between the hangars, makes it a little bit hard for the radio signals from the tower to get to the airplane. So I can legally taxi up to this line that's here in the taxiway before calling up to the tower to request permission to enter the taxiway. One of the refreshing things about aviation is the focus on safety. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure a lot of other people do as well. But we really do take it to the nth degree. So even while we're here, pretty much ready to take off, we're still talking about things that affect the safety of the flight. So one of the things we're talking about here is what happens if the engine doesn't perform as we need it to perform. And there's a whole bunch of different stages on what we do if the engine were to fail. Like if we're still on the ground, then we just, stay on the ground. It would surprise you how many people actually end up taking off, even though the engine isn't mostly doing what they expect it to do. It's one of those things you have to pay attention to, and really, if anything is even slightly wrong, just abort the takeoff and do another check, because you can always look at it, oh look, there's nothing wrong with it, and just go ahead and take off and you'll be fine. But if you do take off and there's something wrong with it, then well, you really limit your options that way. While we're talking about safety, every radio call that is made, and especially calls that the tower gives pilots and instructions to the pilots say back. And talking on the radio isn't the same as talking on the phone. You don't have two people being able to talk at the same time, and the quality isn't always the best. So making pilots, well, we call it read back, but we say the same things that the tower tell us. We make sure that both people are communicating and saying the same thing. You'll also hear me talking to myself a lot. My instructor's here, but even if my instructor wasn't here, I would still be saying these things. And that is to keep my mind on the things that I'm doing and make sure that I'm actually doing the things that I'm saying that I'm doing. And all these things that I'm doing and saying are, again, for the safety of the flight. I want to make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible and there aren't any surprises as we get into the air. Speaking of surprises, this is about the time that we find out how turbulent it's going to be today, which adds an extra layer of stress to the flight for sure. At this point, we've flown out of the airspace that's directly around the airport, and so the tower controller hands us over to departure. I don't think a lot of people know this, or really care to know this. Not all the same airspace above a given area is controlled by the same person. Different people have different, say, jurisdictions over different airspaces. So the tower, that is usually a literal tower that's around the airport, has jurisdiction of that airspace that's directly around the airport. Once you get further out, then it's different controllers that are responsible for a much wider area, and they provide different kinds of services. They're not going to clear you to land or take off or anything like that. That's controlled by the tower. So now that we've actually cleared the area around the airport, we're over to departure, and then they hold us for a little while. We have the option to stay with them. It's called flight following, where they will keep us on their radar and basically be an extra set of eyes. But in this case, they will just say, hey, have a good day, and then we're not really on our own, but they aren't actively watching us. So now we're trying to figure out the cloud layer. Being a student pilot, going for my private pilot's license, I am not allowed legally to fly pretty much anywhere near clouds. Flying through clouds, obviously you can't see through them, so you can't see other airplanes around you, and that can get really dangerous. You wouldn't really think that on a day like today, but if there were a lot more clouds and the clouds were lower, then it would definitely be much, much more dangerous. And on a day like that, I just wouldn't fly. So here we figure out our target altitude of 5,500 feet is still going to be sufficiently low enough below the clouds that we wouldn't be violating any laws or anything like that. Incidentally, being as turbulent as it is, being below the clouds also doesn't help. At some point, I'd like to be able to go above the clouds, which you still can do as a student pilot or a private pilot, as long as the clouds are low enough and as long as there are holes in the cloud that you can essentially fly through. Because again, you can't fly into the clouds, but you can fly around the clouds. And so if you can get around the clouds while also getting on top of them, then the air up there is much, much smoother. Of course, doing that, you may end up putting yourself in a bit of a bad situation if you can't get yourself back down below the clouds. well, that's dangerous. That kind of flying is called VFR on top because you are visual flight rules. That is the only kind of way that you can fly as a student or private pilot without an instrument rating, of course. And the on top obviously means on top of the clouds. So here I'm banking the airplane a little bit so that we can see below us. Before I even started the video here, we did a bunch of planning along the route, and we're trying to spot different landmarks that we said that we would go to on our way to this airport on our cross country. And you'll see that us do this a few times as we just verify landmarks. Yep, we passed that one. Yep, we passed that one. Of course, we have new phones and tablets with GPS, so we know exactly where we are. This exercise is sort of old school. It's still a required thing to know and understand how to do. And just like anything else in aviation, you can't rely on any one piece of equipment to always work. So now you can notice out of the front window you can see the horizon and a bit more terrain, and also quite a bit of turbulence. At this point we have leveled off, so we've reached our target altitude of 5,500 feet. And so it should be a little bit easier to see out the front window from here. And if you haven't figured it out by now, everything in aviation is a checklist. So we climb, we have a checklist. We take off, we have a checklist. We find our destination altitude, we level off, there's a checklist. So here I'm completing that checklist. And then we continue the flight. So we tuned the radio to the ATIS frequency of the airport that we're going to, but there's nothing happening on the other end. We don't find out until a little bit later that for whatever reason they decided to change the frequency of the ATIS for the destination airport. There's something called a NOTAM, that's Notice to Airmen's. It's basically like a broadcast message or publication, like a posting that all pilots and airmen can look up, and it has important information about different things, lights being out or runways under construction, or in this particular case, a change in frequency for ATIS. So we end up calling tower of the destination airport and telling them that we are unable to get the ATIS, but they don't tell us that it's a different frequency. We won't figure that out until later. Anyway, lessons learned. Even though we did all the flight planning up front and nothing said anything on the NOTAMs about changing a frequency, apparently it was published and we missed it. It's about at this time that I start getting a little task saturated. For me, that being the first time to the airport, the first time not at a different airport, but at a different towered airport, turbulence is really heavy. The winds are really gusty, pushing the airplane all around. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot for me to process. So I start getting a little stressed. It's a good learning experience, though. My instructor is trying to tell me how to account for winds and gusts and keeping a little bit of speed into the plane and configuring it slightly different than you normally would for a landing just to compensate for the winds and the gusts. But this is pretty much all going in one ear and out the other as I'm just trying to keep my distance from the ground, my altitude correct. I'm trying to keep my airspeed correct, and traffic control has asked us to report in when we're 2 miles in. We're definitely 2 miles in at this time, so just trying to keep everything in line and do one thing at a time. It's definitely a very fun experience. You can see just how much the wind is pushing this airplane around, and that's kind of nerve-wracking. Not lined up. Kind of lined up. But then we're fast, so that means we're floating down the runway. Gear hasn't touched yet. Gotta try and figure out how to slow down. Oh, there's one landing. There's 2 landings. It definitely felt a lot worse than it looks. So I suppose that's good. Now I need to figure out where the Delta taxiway is that the controller told me to take off on, or taxi out on.
prepping to get our takeoff or our start.
After we stopped and had a bit of a break, time to get back in and fly back home. It was on this flight that I figured out how long the battery on my GoPro lasts, which unfortunately is not the full flight, so prepare yourself for that now. The video is going to cut out just before we get back home to the home airport. Just like before, everything's a checklist. So going through the checklist for starting the airplane back up. This is a new flight. We treat it as a new flight. Not quite as if we've never seen the plane before, but we still don't want to skimp on anything or miss anything. Anything could have happened to the plane while we weren't here, even though it was only about 30 minutes.
Clear prop.
It did briefly cross my mind what we would do if we couldn't get the engine started again.
10 seconds up. Okay. I don't understand. Especially if it's hot. 10 seconds up. Keep it on. Throttle all the way back. Mixture all the way up. Once it starts. Okay. There we go. Still clear. Let's prime it 3 more times. Do a normal start.
And third time's a charm. Here again, we are trying to figure out what's wrong with ATIS. We don't figure out what's wrong with it for a few more minutes. So there's a general rule in aviation here where VFR pilots, which I am a VFR pilot, if you're flying under VFR, then there are two sets of altitudes that you will fly at, and the sets are dependent on which direction you're flying. So if you're flying generally east, then your altitude should be odd. If you're generally west, then your altitude should be even. And if you're flying VFR, then you take that even or odd and you add 500 feet. So from my home airport to the airport we did the cross country to was north-northwest or north-northeast, as it were. And so since it is generally east, it's on the east side of the compass, then the altitude should be odd, plus 500, so our altitude on the way there was 5,500. It could have also been 3,500 or 7,500 or anything like that. On the way back, since it is, the opposite direction, it's south by southwest, so on the west side of the compass, and our altitude should be on the evens. So on the way back we chose 4,500. Could have easily also been 6,500 or 8,500. Not 2,500 because that altitude would put us too low above the ground. So these altitudes are also what we call MSL. That's mean sea level. The altitude is measured based off of sea level, not off of the ground level, which would be AGL, above ground level. Generally, in aviation, altitudes, when you're communicating altitudes or anything like that, you're almost always going to be MSL. So everybody's flying on the same plane, the same kind of level. Because as you can imagine, flying over the land, the altitude is going to change. Now, where I live here in the Midwest, it's a whole lot of flat, so it's not going to change too much, but in most places in the world, flying from one airport to the next, you may change quite a bit of altitude. So everything being based off of mean sea level makes it a little bit easier, more consistent. Think of it like time zones. If everybody used Zulu time zone or Greenwich Mean Time, then everybody would be going to bed at different times, but everybody would always be talking about the same time. This is how cool my instructor is. Takes the hat off his head and puts it right in the sun visor that's there. It's coming straight through the middle where the visor doesn't quite meet the top of the roof of the plane. Sun's hitting me right in the eye, so he takes his hat off and put it in there. So this was a little bit odd and caught me off guard, but on initial contact coming back, they directly cleared me to land on the runway. So there you go. We were still pretty far out, but got the clearance. Start making our way in. As I said before at the beginning, the battery in my GoPro ended up dying a little bit early. You can almost see the airport there. It's a little green patch almost on the horizon to the right. So we're really close to the runway, really close to the end of the video anyway. But sorry it ran out early, and also sorry about the audio. Someday I'll figure out how to get this working correctly. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Haxie, and you've been watching Haxie Flies. Have a good day.